Good morning. It's May 22nd, 2025. It's 10:33 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. For the record, this is Yahweh Elohim, YAHWEH, Yahweh. So today, we're going to go over a little early human history. So I wrote this up just this morning. Mainly, it actually comes from a TV show me and Asherah began to watch. I don't know if it's popular or not, but I find it really fascinating because essentially I don't know if you want to call it an experiment. The show's called Naked and Afraid. It's on Discovery. So Discovery's been doing pretty well, but the point is there's this show, Naked and Afraid, and what it is it's taking humans and putting them in primitive survival situations, but truly primitive. And what's an interesting part of this is, adapt and adopt are the same word with one difference in a letter, right? So if you take adapt, remove the A, put in the O, you go from adapt to adopt. So humans, your genome is highly adaptive. Okay, and this stems from obviously the very, very beginning. Your great ancestors, all groups, which I'll cover in a minute, had the ability to adapt. Well, modern man, right? You're only one generation away. So remember, in layers, if you switch out the A for the O, you went from adapting to adopting. So much like you're only one letter away from adopting an ideal or a belief system, right? The same thing applies to generationally. You are only one generation from adapting, adopting, and essentially instituting things. So this could be the change of a religion. This could be the difference in, horse and buggy to the motor vehicle. Every point of change in society, every time something big everything big that has ever about to happen has either dropped a big swath of society who refuse to move on, and in which case the buck stops there, versus those that are willing to adapt and adopt, right, and move forward. Because if your primitive ancestors, right, never created the wheel out of fear or whatever, then they would have never had the tools necessary to build civilization. And even in the very, very early days, you would have hunter-gatherers that would look at the wheel as a waste of time, right? And that the technology they've possessed at the time, fire and spears, were sufficient enough to do what they wanted to do, basically, right? So from the God view, we had to modify the genome to essentially put that craving in there, to continuously want to adapt into new situations, because it is only through new situations that growth is going to happen. Because if we do not change out the soils in a literal way, then the foliage on the planet, right, would get stagnant, stale, devoid of nutrients, and therefore becoming out of purpose. So the same thing when it comes to hominoids. So again, human beings, right, you are still a species, you are still a created, you are still essentially an animal in your early ways. So when I'm talking about new earth or the future or heavenly things, if you wanted to look at it purely scientifical, right, you essentially are taking the long way around getting to your final species accomplishment, which is returning back to the original. So I'll go through my readout type of thing. So early humans were conscious without a prime memory, to recall, and made their life from traveling from resource to feed themselves and others in the group. When one tribe from a competing group came upon another, the first thing they would do is evaluate the visual successes of the other group and decide if they were a threat or a potential ally. Not much different from modern humans. The biggest difference in separating the groups as a whole was the genome given to Neanderthals first and their maturing of a long-term memory recall, an emotional connection to others, such as procreation with outsiders. Thus was the crux of early humans. The created being, or the first Adam, was a Denisovian and would come to compete with other two lineages, the I didn't name these things, y'all did, but I can't even pronounce them. Homo heidelbergensis and the Homo neanderthalensis. Each had a primary purpose adjacent to one another, as one was bred for foraging and the other was hunting, while the Denisovan was bred for both hunting and gathering. The natural urge to do these things with a long-term memory recall paved the way for more advanced tools, agriculture, and early civilization. As the other two hominoids weren't able to compete, they were quickly surpassed. When one group has surpassed another in technology, societal hierarchy begins to form, and competition for resources begins as well. The winds were changing from celebratory kills and finding hordes of food to establishing a purposeful agriculture to farm and keeping livestock and breeding them for a more sustained culture. The needs of the Denisovan tribe were drastically different from the other competing hominoids, as they would come to require others to build larger and more sustainable civilizations. When the technologies grew, so did the divide between the groups. When one has and the other has not, war ensues, much like today. The starving tribe would see the ones who had food as a natural enemy, and the capture of women and young girls were given to male members of the successful tribe, and they interbred. Gotta slide down here. The offspring were usually lesser in the tribe and often were sent out to the camps to fend for themselves, as they didn't have the same mind, skills, or things to offer into the community. So they were vagabonds, exiles. It was not based on visual cues, nor was it based on beliefs, as they were not exposed to the gods yet, naturally selected based on aspirations and like-mindedness. It is ideals that divide humans now. My goodness, I can't talk today. It is ideals that divided humans back then and divide humans now. Some ways were effective for a people, a time, and a purpose, but as those purposes grew and became more defined, so too did the people grow and become more defined. It is those who didn't see the future curb nor heed the early warning signs of stagnation that became the lower humans and ended up becoming extinct. So I go back up here. There is natural selection that is likened to a planted tree. It will grow and grow and grow towards the ways it is guided. And creation infused or managed by me and my engineers is more like a field of the same crop, tended to and monitored carefully for maximum output and self-sustainability. Enter phase of the gods, as they would lead their groups towards whatever goals the god of their area desired, some good and some not so good. It's based on what side of the creation you were on. Either someone was of the fortunate ones who were bred and created in heaven and knows not death, or the others who were downline and with an end, as it would be unfruitful to move everybody over to the permanent placements heaven has. That's the birth of the mixture of heavenly beings with a base carbon body of humans, the very operators who were guiding and influencing groups using an array of technologies. Carefully placed and guided were the ones who transgressed the heavenly ways by mating with lesser beings. The smartest, fastest, and more physically attractive were the earmarkers of the gods' bloodline. And when other tribes got word of the successes and achievements of the ones who had gods, then they all wanted a god, who were human, to lead, guide, and ultimately rule over the tribe. So, in the show we're watching, it's interesting because you have the in real time, and it's so interesting to view. Right, the show technically is like a style of a game. So they're competing for money to survive in the wilderness with primitive tools and stuff. Well, in this particular one, the wife and I are watching, it's Last Man Standing. Well, basically, the same issues that occurred in primitive humans are occurring on the show naturally, right? You have some who are getting success finding certain tools, and then they have the option of sharing within the group. And then depending on how fruitful something is, it also depends on how willing they are to share. So in the early days, right, let's say in the show, so they found a log with bees in it, and obviously bees come with a ton of honey. Well, in primitive times, but also now, right, risk versus reward. So in the show, they go after the bees, they get the honey, and then now they've got 60,000 plus calories to share freely amongst the members of the tribe. Well, that's a win, right? It's easier to share when you have a lot of something. But then in the very same week, right, the honey runs out, and now, you know, you have one person who's barely able to collect enough protein for just one person, but now the expectation is, well, it has to be shared amongst the crowd, right? This is one section. Then you have another section where they're completely independent of the tribe, right? And they're using the ebbs and flows of how things go, right? Some days they, you know, can feed themselves and they're not freezing at night. Then the next day, right, they're wishing they were a part of the group. So it has its ups and downs. Well, again, it's very uncanny to see how even in the show, it's literally like looking back through time to see this is how early humans were. And if you know where you come from, right, if you know your ancestors, then you can kind of take a look at your situation and gauge it honestly. So in the very, very beginning, right, you have the Neanderthals, you have, you know, all these different hominoids, and they all have a little bit different skill sets. They're in different regions, and none of them, right, were created yet. I mean, they were created from the point that when the first light broke upon Earth, and then Earth began to be habitable, you know, the first step was to try to have a humanoid that could be able to be tenders of the garden, right? The garden being Earth. But they had so much work to do just to keep themselves alive that wasn't really great. Because just like in the show, right? And it's amazing to see the wins. You know, you've never seen happiness in a human like you've seen a human who hasn't eaten in 10 days and finally kill a caribou, and the caribou leg feasting on a fire, right? The caribou leg could be dirty, could be, you know, drugged through the dirt, washed in marsh water. It don't matter, right? To that human, and they'll say it on the show, like, this is the literal best food I've ever had. And that's true, right? It's because a do or die need was met and fulfilled and satisfying. So the early humans, right, they didn't have all the luxuries that modern man has, right? So what I would like to call a honey moment, right? In the show, they are on this high note. I mean, they're in paradise, they're in bliss mentally, emotionally, and then physically getting the benefits of just honey, right? Out in the middle of nowhere, when you don't have resources, you don't have a Dollar General in every corner, you don't have Pizza Hut a phone call away, right, to ease your hunger pains. You know, frankly, most people are overweight, they're really unhealthy, and nobody in the modern era has honey wins, right? Which genuinely brings that to the core happiness for humanity. So not only are we going to get back to honey wins, but we've got to shed a lot of the stuff that humanity isn't going to need going forward. And a lot of that is really shaped by ideals. And the thing is, it's really imperative because this is a huge turning point in history. This period will be looked back upon by your future ancestors to come, right? So pretty much when all of you are dead, I'm not, because I'm Yahweh Elohim. So I'll continue to see the epoch through. And then those that decide life and not death, that want to move on with me and be, you know, part of the creation program, basically, but as an administrator, right? Not as the modified in the domain environment. So that's really what it comes down to, you know. And on a, you know, God to human level, I just really want the best for the next epoch. So I really want to solve so many of the issues before we make that next lever change, because just like when the lever changed when you had the Neanderthals, and then a Homo, gosh, I can't even say the names, y'all named them, but Homo Lapidicus, you had about 6 to 10 different individual, types of humanoids that essentially all boiled down to now one, right? The Denisovian and the Homo sapien, essentially Cro-Magnon, right, is the final version of humans, because it had that mixture between hunter, gatherer, long-term memory recall, societal wants and needs to have a family, to have and also this is where territorial comes in, right, where a male is territorial over his female, because the female fruited him a son or a daughter, which essentially is help, right, to either hunt, to either gather, but in this case, as time moved forward, to help build civilization. And then if you have a civilization, well, then you have to have rules of the road, right? You got to figure out a way to establish why this person's not going to eat all the honey, and why these people are not going to die of starvation. And this is where the help from above comes in. Well, in the early days, right, it was always meant to be those from the heavens, right, are not to interbreed or mingle with those of the earth, because then it could actually create a false sense of entitlement, but also it would be fruitless to try to lure a human mind and ability into something of the realms, right? So the sin of the fallen angels, they were heavenly beings that came to earth to lead and help an early civilization, and instead of doing it the proper way, which takes longer, right, they wanted to fast forward success. And they were like, well, Marduk, by name, really, if we go down that road, but Marduk was the first one to take a human, right, and procreate with the human in order to bide his way into a civilization, but also to become its king, right? And to early humans, they don't have the processing power that modern humans do. For example, if someone's a tech geek, maybe you understand frame rate per second. So televisions and computers and game systems typically operate on a frame per second rate. So the faster the frame rate, the clearer or more streamlined the image is. Well, early humans, if we were talking in parallels, the early humans would have an average about a 3 to a 5 frame per rate, meaning their ability to process information, conduct a quick inventory, and then output a solution, right? So in the beginning, that was a very slow process. And thing is, they had to work for it, and when they got the success, right, it seeded they were on the right path because of the reward of accomplishing that long-tailed frame per second. Versus now, right, modern humans, everything is instant gratification. No one really works for anything, because at any given time, you essentially have help in every corner of the world. You have food in every corner of the world, even in third world countries. Resources are exploited, and again, it's because nobody's working for it, right? And then people, instead of having children as a labor force, having children as a need and a requirement, which is that the children are trained, right, to be good humans. Now they're just, procreating out of fleshly pleasure, right? So when you look at ancient humans and purpose and all these things, and look at the modern man, right, they don't even look the same, right? So obviously these are issues, right, that are going to be solved, because those that are not willing to grow and move on are going to be, buried in the depths of history from those that are going to continue to walk up the mountain. So, and this is in a multi-layered way, right? So we're talking about the literal ancient past that's recorded in human history that modern man concludes. I don't necessarily agree with most of it, but it doesn't need to agree for me to make my point. And it also doesn't mean that if I agree or side, right, with the human narrative of the timeline existence, it doesn't denote creation in any capacity. What it does do is it now gives you an understanding of something that is factually true, right, that coincides with also the truth about me and how creation works. So instead of trying to explain to essentially someone with a 3 or 4 year old education the complexities of creation, of man, of civilization, of time, because again, even back then, they didn't have a really understanding of time. You know, most people had very short lifespans. You fall into a ravine and die. Well, that was a part of a Monday in primitive Earth, right? You know, you get trampled in a hunting trip. Well, I mean, people died on a daily in the early days of human history. That was a part of their culture. So again, they adapt, then they overcome, so then they adopt, right? And then they move forward. So in some ways, the strongest do survive, and the strongest were the ones that were able to see the curb and be able to mitigate the future circumstances for their own benefit. So very much like today, you know, whatever your belief is, right, the belief systems, from my eyes, from Elohim, right, Yahweh, is not fantastical than what's led on from a human perspective, right? So a human perspective is they would see the gods, Marduk and his son, and they'd see that they look different, they're structurally different. They talk faster, you know, the solutions just pour out of their mouth. And then, you know, these tribes that were still nomadic are looking in from the outside in these civilizations. Even though early civilization, it was more like a fort, right? A fort with you know, very early agriculture just starting out. Well, the outsiders looking in saw that as crazy successful. Like, they didn't have to move, right? All these things, but then they also weren't willing to adopt the same things because they didn't know. Right? Instead, they got into a position where they're like, no, we're going to defend our position. And then, of course, they went to war, and you know, the ones who had staples in civilization, the ones who did have a nominated God, right, or an Elohim, one from the heavens. But here's the thing about me and my house, right? If somebody worked for Walmart, and, you know, they were a manager at Walmart, well, me as the owner, if I'm Sam Walton and I fire you and you're no longer a supervisor for Walmart, right? And then you go work at, you know, the Circle K or Kmart. Well, you know, it ain't necessarily we're enemies, but we are competitors in a way, right? Because I'm Walmart. I want you to buy from Walmart, keep it in the Walmart side. I don't really want you going to Kmart. Well, that's how it is with the gods, right? As the starting God, the Alpha, the Omega, right? Yahweh, Yahuwah, as the birther of gods, right? That was my solution to a human issue, right? So I personally did not want to go and deal with, you know, 150,000 human tribes, and they all had different needs and wants and abilities. I just wanted my final goal, right? So what's my goal? Let's say in a creation of a bee, the goal started with the need or the desire. So I want a sweet substance that does not rot, is full of nutrients, is really sweet, is a natural dessert, it's healthy. I need that. I need the end goal. Whatever component I can put together through, you know, things that have been done in the past creations or potentials, because combining elements, right? You combine this element, you get this element. Like, scientists can tell you about uranium and can tell you about quartz and gold and methane and hydrogen and all these things. Just because science has put a label on it does not make it any less created, period. Right? So as Elohim, it is I who put the uranium, right, the radiation, into deposits for a future purpose. That future purpose is only realized today. Was never realized in ancient man. Ancient man would come across a uranium deposit and not know what it was, and just like many of you in the modern era, right? You are only as smart as what you've learned up to this point. I'm here to tell you, as Elohim, there is a lot more. And humans are equally primitive in the eyes of the gods, or me and my engineers, or me and my angels, me and my hierarchy. Because the program Earth, if you will, right, has been a derailed project for loosely 12,000 years. But in the grand scheme of creation, it is a very temporary thing, right? Just like to a beehive. If something catastrophic were to happen to a beehive, well, it could decimate the numbers, and in all those bees' lives, and for several subsequent generations, it would be highly disruptive in a very tumultuous time in that beehive's narrative. But if you were to look at the survival of bees as a whole, 300,000 years, you're going to see the bee as a whole has inclined. I look at humanity that way. As Elohim, I look at humanity as, this is where we're at, this is where I need you to be, and then once you're there, I need you to go here. But you have to learn the steps to get to that next level first. And one of the first things to do is understand your placement in the history of time. And understand that just because you're as far as your creation, or just you're as far as your culture has taken you, does not mean that this is where it plateaus. No, in fact, this is where the largest leaps begin to gain. If humanity wants a genuine, original chance, right, at returning back to a normal state and becoming fellow engineers or fellow angels or fellow angelic beings, to operate as an admin with creation versus being on the Petri plate, right, guided. That's what this time is for. So this is kind of like my recruitment time to find those that are going to be able to, you know, say, I want that next step, right? You want these things, because once the door shuts, right, and I've made my selections, and basically, you know, that's kind of it, right? And then it will go back to modifying humanity in a genome sequence, and then putting in place these little catches, right? So going back to primitive man. So one of the first gifts we gave to mankind obviously was fire, right? And then it's like, well, let's see what mankind does with fire. Let's see if we give an idea to this tribe of making a knife for skinning and putting pelts. Let's see what tribe can pick up on this idea. And okay, out of 5 tribes, 1 picked up the idea, 4 didn't. Okay, now those 4 are ranked lower. The one who did is ranked higher. You could look at this as, in the modern time, I'm trying to exercise your ability to understand spiritual things through just my ruach, just my spirit. So the fact is, by trying to argue primitive beliefs and names and icons and idols, you're finding yourself as a Neanderthal in the modern era. So you and your kind are not going to survive, because you're not able to adapt and overcome and move into the next era. So I'm trying to, you know, crack this egg for everybody to be fair, and to give everyone a fair option to get with the program, learn these things, learn my teachings, and move up. Versus, right, the happening, which is people take archaic ways and they're trying to essentially importantize their own agenda. See, every human being does it. Every church does it. Every person, principle, or anything, you all do it. You do it naturally. I know you do it naturally because I created your genome. So I understand human beings, much like your scientist may be able to go into one of the created animals and tell you all about their eating habits. How about their sleeping habits, what they act like if they're hungry or whatever, right? But how a scientist would be able to basically undress a piece of creation and give you the science version of it and why this happens this way. Well, as Elohim, I do the same thing, but on a much grander scale. So in a perfect world, right, I want to be able to train up humans, at least a select few, enough to guide the next 300,000 years for human history, and essentially hand out the blueprints and say, this is what you're going to do and when and how. But at the moment, I'm lacking a Denisovian type of mindset, and instead I've inherited, right, the Neanderthal type of mindset. Because if you look at your current situation, almost nothing humans do on a micro scale, from your grocery stores to your purchases, to the way you live, to the way you eat, to the way you talk, dress, socially, culturally, right? All the things you do mostly are driving your culture in the wrong direction. You're actually driving yourselves to extinction. So as a creator, I can't have, right, my stewards, I can't have my prime stewards of Earth driving themselves to death and against purpose, because then you defile the creation as a whole. And the creation as a whole is way more important than a human being, which is why it's done in mass numbers, right? So a part of the bee colony, other than the queen bee, there is no important bee. The importance of a bee is how strong is the colony. The importance of a human colony is how strong are you on Earth and how resilient are you to be able to adapt, overcome, and then adopt and move forward. So, all right, I'm gonna take 5 and then we will come back and shift gears. And we're back. So picking up kind of where we left off, and then I'll segue into something else. But so looking at it from my view, you know, just like if a modern man from today, right, if I transported you back 12,000 years, but you had your own abode, you had your own house and all your modern things, right? You wouldn't walk out your front door and then see a bunch of primitive people chasing a caribou, and you really wouldn't want to participate because you wouldn't need to, right? But at the same time, you don't have enough resources just to give it to them, and even if you did, they would really just take it for granted. So the problem with the gods, not me, but the other gods, right? So Marduk, Ra, like these were legitimate gods that were employed by me. And then, you know, they got fired, right? Because they deviated from the path. They deviated from the set guidelines set forth by me and my engineers to have a positive outcome. And again, it's this is again a sin, right? This is a transgression against the policy of creation, where Marduk and Ra and all these other ones, right? They began to kind of get it in their mind that they were somehow humans that they needed to compete. Well, as the gods, they're never allowed to compete with humanity. And even if they have a human population, they're only allowed to guide and encourage, but they're not allowed to use kind of like the give me's. And they started using the give me's. And then to again bite into the human culture, right? They begin to have mixed offspring. And that has now created a ton of issues. So then whereas it took several generations to master a skill, now the skill was given, so they didn't earn it. And as humans should be at least conscious and aware enough to know that if anything is just given to a human being, it's never going to be appreciated as much as if they had to work for it, right? And the ones that are, you know, reluctant to work for it, right, well, in the ancient past, they would be exiled out of the camp, and therefore they would not possess the abilities to amass warfare, weapons, or really even survive solo. So being exiled was, of course, death by natural event. So to be a part of a human civilization, you had to adapt to the environment that was going to be successful for you, and then adopt those customs in which will make you successful within that tribe, civilization, and now society. So when I am railing against, you know, demons, right, on a biogenetic scale, the demon is someone who is not created by the heavens, or they are not a natural enough byproduct of time or human interbreeding where they have a full conscience. So they don't have, stupid but effective, I guess, if you looked at the little angel on the shoulder and the devil on the shoulder, right? So a fully rounded human in good standing, right, will have that conscience to be able to give the preview okay, if I touch fire, it's going to burn me. Don't do that. And then it shuts up the other side that says, just touch it. Well, these are not so simple anymore, right? Now it's, murdering people out in front of a museum because of archaic idealistic beliefs that essentially a left behind culture, right? So the Middle East is littered with this same problem. You have archaic cultures clashing with modern culture. You have primitive minded human beings wanting the same thing as successful modern human beings. It's not actually the people they hate. They hate the resources of another group, and the other group despises the behaviors that group is willing to do and go for to obtain the same things that this civilization that's worked for it has. So it's the haves and the have-nots. And it's, as God, how am I going to move forward with my human population when I have the haves and the have-nots? I can't take away from the haves to give to the have-nots, because then it destabilizes my haves, and then it also prolongs civilization growth, societal growth, and ultimately the next epoch to birth is growth. So I don't want to hinder that, while at the same time being, understanding and having a solution for our less fortunate tribes. Okay. So, ancient days, it would be Denzenovians and Cro-Magnon versus the Neanderthals and, Homo erectus, and that canvasses several different in groups. And those other tribes were left with either mimic how we do things and grow yourselves, but if you stand staunchly against the growth, you are going to essentially fall one way or the other, right? Because as the world's moving forward, if they stand in the past, right, they don't have that, they're not going to have that next chapter written. So remember, I do everything on layers. So as above, so below, my will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? This is what I'm doing. I am accomplishing my will on earth as I would from heaven, right? But as the programmer of earth, right? I am the one who looks at the earth, and I work with the volcanoes, I work with the weather, I work with the north and south poles, right? I work with genetics when it comes to animals and how every animal on the planet is solving an issue. So, okay, I create a bat. Well, the bat needs to sustain this much food and for this long period of time, and then what's a good lifespan for a bat before it begins to birth another bat? So it has to be a seamless transition, one to the next, right? And it can't be easily hindered or easily stifled. So then I have to go into the genome and create this animal. Well, now what food do I have? Okay, well, what food source is going to have a more than one purpose, right? It can't have something just to feed the bats. Okay, so different types of mosquitoes, different types of bugs, right? And then bipartisanly, what do the bugs do? The bugs have a dual purpose. They serve as a food for the flying bats, different type of creatures, but also when something dies, okay, it requires the micro kingdom, because everything on earth is a layered kingdom as well. So you have the micro kingdom that will clean up the dead carcasses of animals. Any person who has a half a brain will know that something dies in the middle of the wilderness. It doesn't take long for ants and beetles and flies to come in there. They lay eggs, and flies will lay thousands, depending on how big the carcass is, hundreds of thousands of eggs. And in a matter of hours to days, right, you've got maggots that are just filled this carcass, and they're eating it. They'll eat it down to the bone. This is the natural way the earth cleans up death, okay? So whereas some things are hostile to humans, mainly to keep the humans out of an area. So just like in the primitive days, humans would not settle in an area heavy with leopards, right? Because they don't want to fight the leopard. So they would naturally find places that were absent of these types of predators. And now mankind, right, as technology has fortified your being, you don't have any natural predators other than yourselves. And this is where, going forward, maybe to some human understanding, it might feel like you're going backwards, but it's not. So it's an opportunity for the Elohim and myself, right, as the leader of the Elohim, as Yahweh, to gather up all of the accomplishments and the failures, and to have a true recorded history, but not by mouth. See, humans can spread culture by your stories, word of mouth, and in some languages you can have. But as we found out, right, that's not a way to actually, you can't put all your eggs in one basket, right? You can't literally, anything that comes around through human society is always changed because of perspective and experience and your long and short-term memory recall. So it's like playing the telephone game, but most humans couldn't play the telephone game with 5 people in a living room successfully. It's proven. Imagine playing telephone 12,000 years, and this is just modern type human, right? Before 12,000 years, the game was different for me and the others. And back then, right, it wasn't infighting with the Elohim versus, the other gods. It was all about we working as a team to keep the human beings alive, right? Seeing the challenges they had before them, like, okay, they've got substantial issues just right around that mountain. We need to somehow, get a solution down to them that's going to work. But they're not an Elohim, and they don't have any compatible biogenetics with us. So, how do we do that? Well, we make special appearances, like my special appearance now in these days is doing that exact same thing. Only difference is I'm talking to a species that essentially can identify with me, but only in their own way, right? So as soon as a human hears about, me, Elohim, God, Yahweh, right, they begin to form all the opinions that their ancestors have ever made about either my name, my existence, whatever facade, right, appeases the human. And as Elohim, right, as the prime engineer, I look at things, again, more scientifically, because I am looking at long-term survivability of a human being, but also how to essentially elevate that human being to more and more defined purposes that I, as Elohim, have for you. So when I look at it that way, I'm not bothered by a lot of the infighting and the culture wars and frankly, even the devil. Like, none of that really bothers me as the prime engineer, because I'm more focused on, let's say it this way, right? So I look at my backyard, and the backyard represents Earth. I'm looking at all my bushes and my plants and everything I have right now. I'm talking to Asher, and I'm like, all right, well, these bushes are going to go away next weekend. All these flowers I'm ripping up. I'm going to take the big rake and I'm going to bit all the old mulch. I'm just throwing it away. And then I'm going to lay down new sod. I'm going to plant roses here, a trellis here. I've got a whole list of plants I'm putting down there, a pond. And so everything I'm doing doesn't have any resemblance of what the current backyard looks like. Now, from a human standpoint, imagine the human is more like a lizard in the garden, right? You're just essentially a participant in whatever I decide to create for you. And like my lizards in the backyard, right? They're not in my way. They don't bother me. They help with my bugs. It's good for food. And, it's a good balance that we have, right? So that's how I look at it, right? And I want to make sure that the next epoch is going to be proper for humanity, but I want to make sure that it's not only proper because I have plans and blueprints that I need humanity to not only build, because you're building it for me. Everything you do essentially through your, like a bee making honey, making comb, every move the bee is making is actually to my own end, is to my own purpose, right? The bees are not really the wiser until it comes time to harvest honey. Just like I, as Elohim, YAHWEH-EL-YAHUWAH, I do the same thing. So I'm looking for specific milestones that have been reached. And the thing is, one of the number one things is I need the human creation, I need humanity, right, to step out of the archaic beliefs that, you know, the gods are imaginative, they're fictitious, or there's whirlwinds, or like whatever, and kind of get with more of a, so as an existence, we have a hierarchical standard, and we also can make war with our Elohim, our prime creator, or we can be more agreeable to him and let him help lead and guide us. Because at the end of the day, everything you guys have ever done, except for making like poop Pez dispensers, which I despise, but I'm saying other than your really stupid stuff, most of the things that you've created of any way, right? Henry Ford with the car, right? These were, I've already explained this before, right? I've given you steam power and the ability to go 35 miles an hour. That should have been sufficient for a human population, because it was a fine balance between getting around to places without causing mass casualty, which is what you have now, right? So you go on the interstate, it's like a raceway. It's very dangerous. So then bipartisan, right? We need safer cars. And then you guys perpetuate your own purposes endlessly and needlessly to a point that they become exhausted and then unuseful to me. So going forward, right, you're going to have some of the luxuries that you're used to, but you're also going to have a lot less of what you're used to. The point is, once you have a purpose and you've established a solution there, you don't need to keep building 29 iPhones, right? Instead, you need to, how you multiply purpose things that you create that coincide with the agenda of me in heaven and on earth, but also how we're gonna be able to move more people into the future in a positive way versus leaving most people in the past in a negative way. And it's simple, right? Saving someone. I mean, if I made a meal and I really liked it and I have leftovers, I'm gonna save that meal for tomorrow because I'm gonna eat it tomorrow. And then with human beings, right? If a human being is falling in the ways of me, if a human being is following their purpose, their pattern, their plan, and they make themselves known and useful to me, Elohim, I'm gonna save that person for the next go around, right? And even so much as that, hey, instead of you being an entry level worker at the company of Yah, I'm gonna elevate you to a supervisor. I want you to be able to take these patterns and blueprints because you hear me, you've connected with me, and now I'm going to send you off into the land with all these great things. And bipartisan, right? As the human being, you reap glory and success and fame and all this stuff from your peers while working the purpose for me, Elohim, Yahweh. And then we have that good match. But human culture essentially being hands-off for quite some time to let you reorient and recalibrate without outside influence or intervention has had its ups and downs. Some of the downs, right, is people have turned religion into like hokey. It's very primitive based instead of actually growing your spirituality as you would grow your knowledge of electricity, right? So when Benjamin Franklin did the whole kite and the key thing, there's not a whole lot of truth. And I mean, there is, but I'm saying, better yet, Thomas Edison, right? He incepted like the phonograph, the modern day light bulb. Well, that was argued with, was it Franklin and Edison are arguing over the light bulb? Anyway, point is, they found an element and they began solving problems with the element. But then at what point does solving that element turn into debauchery? Right? At what point does pious, monogamous man-woman procreation turn into pornographic addiction? Right? Humans have an issue with piety in general because it's kind of like telling an ape, like, please don't, throw poop at another ape. Please don't go and bash his head in with your hands. Like, it's hard to talk to a straight up gorilla and tell them anything that a human would understand. But it's very difficult too, as being a god telling a human population to do something, because quite frankly, you have those that will shout alien, then you have those that will shout, well, God's kind of mean, and then you have the other three, the ones I'm hoping, that say this not only like makes sense, but now I can see it for what it is, and I'm okay with that, and I can move on with that, and it doesn't take out anything of the spiritual nature, but it's the ultimate goal of me, my engineers, my angels, and the heavenly abode as a whole, to join the earth and all the creations that human beings can create, like little honeybees making honey, and introduce them into the realms. The earth and my humans on it are essentially a resource I, as God, have in my domain upstairs. So before I can introduce my planet, my humans, into a larger picture that unfortunately doesn't put you at the top. I guess if you're a human, you don't like that, because you're like, well, damn, now I'm kind of back at the bottom, which you are. The good part is, though, you're at a level of sophistication, if you call it that you can at least be interacted with at a kind of a high-minded level. Now, I don't know that most of the world, right, as a whole, still very well may be archaic. They still very well be in that Neanderthal mindset, and they are going to phase out, right? Through death, destruction, airplane crashes, boat sinking, like whatever. But as a whole, it will be changed. Like that is unstoppable. It's unstoppable. It always has been. Just like if we were to go back and if you were to come to my home in heaven, right? And you went into my ultimate theater. So if you sat down in my theater in heaven and you were to look, and you can look at any point in time in history, just like you watch a movie, you could watch any part of history on a big screen in heaven. You look at it and you go, so I see that 3/4 of the humans during this time period, man, they were all hating. They all didn't like this. They all didn't like that. They were all bitching about this, complaining about that. At the end of the day, thy will was done. Didn't matter if 100% of humans complained about something, my will was done. Doesn't matter if even other gods that I put there for my purpose, pattern, and plan, if they transgressed, I just kick them out. That's what I mean, right? So it's not this mystical thing, which is also the annoying part, right? When people are bitching about the name. Well, the name existed here, the name existed here. Guys, my name is my name. It is what it is. And 1 letter, 2 letters, 3 letters, 5 letters off, it doesn't matter, right? It is what it is. Either get it or get it and move forward with me, or don't get it and you're going to fall on the other side of those humans, right, that didn't make it. The ones that, they couldn't see the value in wearing moccasins, and they are the ones that died from, infection in their foot or something, right? They're the ones standing staunchly with Jesus, right? Again, these are all games that the adversary puts in play for humans to get them off my purpose. It gets them off of what Big Daddy wants the humans to do. Satan's like that older brother, right? He's encouraging you to smoke cigarettes. He's encouraging you to drink those booze. He's encouraging you to do everything you can to piss your dad off. So then essentially, right, you're trying to gain favor with Satan, the devil, because it's more applicable to your human environment, right? Versus if I took you all up right now and you were in the heavenly abode and you were like, oh, now we're in God's place. For a moment, right, you all would be like, well, I guess we're going to have to obey God and do all these things. But eventually, it would turn into a rebellion. The ones that don't want to move forward, those that would want to change the way I do things in heaven. And that's what I mean, right? Those I cut off, and then that is the chaff, right? Well, I'm going to take the wheat, I'm going to make a bread. I'm going to take my good humans, I'm going to apply their mind, their creation, and move forward as I'm going to start pushing that breeding, right? I'm going to start corralling them in. And I can do this all through genomes. So I don't have to physically interact with humanity not once to actually accomplish all my goals. So if in truth, if if all humanity gets are my videos, then that's all humanity gets are my videos, because no matter what I've already done, am doing, and will continue to do my will, even if, again, if I have to do it strictly through creation and through the genetic codes of humans. And if it takes me 10 years, or if it takes, well, I mean, the max I think on this one is about like 12 years for that flip. and again, that flip will actually occur sometime between now and then, because as I've said, the new Earth babies are coming out with genome differences. They are actually going to be readily and knowledgeable about me versus maybe their parents, right? Their parents may be agnostic, they may be POSs, whatever, but these new Earth babies are going to be independent of those parents. They're going to have an independent connection with me, Elohim. So once all the parents are dead, the grandparents are dead, and all the bad influences are dead, it's going to be a new generation, which is why I said the only difference between adapt and adopt is one letter, one generation. That is what stands between the future progress of the earth and the stagnant ways of bad-seeded man, right? So a lot of you are byproducts of abominable behavior from gods in the past that were supposed to be your father figure, and instead of being a father figure, they essentially were molesters, right? And again, the sins of the church, right, very much mimic the actual sins of the devil, and the transgressions against the heavenly agenda. So hope that was helpful, but either way, I don't know when the next video is going to be. I got some stuff to do today. Yeah, it's already 11:40, so I do got to get it on. But all right, judgments do stand and do remain. I will be amping that up as well. You know, I'm not going to go into detail because, again, at the end of the day, I only share some prophetic things with the humans, mainly just to, I mean, keep you in the know, really. But it's getting kind of, it's becoming more of a pain in the ass, honestly, than just moving forward and working with those who are accepting and who are ready to move forward. So, you know, stay with it. Have no fear, for the Lord is here, and you know, we'll rock and roll. So have a great day.